Barnaby Brocket, Chapter 3. When 4 years passed and nothing had changed, Barnaby's family had to accept that this wasn't a phase after all. It was just the way their son had been born. Alistair and Eleanor took him to a local doctor who examined him thoroughly and suggested that they give him a couple of pills and call him again in the morning. But this did nothing to improve matters. They took him to see an out-of-town specialist who placed him on a course of antibiotics, but still he continued to float, although he became completely immune to a bad flu that was raging through Kirribilli that week. Finally, they drove him into the centre of Sydney for an appointment with a famous consultant, who simply shook his head and said that the boy would grow out of it in time. Boys usually grow out of everything in the end, he said, smiling as he passed across a rather large invoice for the rather short time he'd spent examining Barnaby. Their trousers, their good behaviour, their willingness to respect parental authority. You simply have to be patient, that's all. None of which helped Alistair or Eleanor in the least, and in fact only served to frustrate them even more. Now Barnaby slept in the lower bunk in Henry's room, where a couple of blankets had been stitched to the underside of his brother's bed to prevent him from hitting his head against the springs. "It's nice to be able to see our ceiling again, isn't it?" said Alistair, when the mattress in their bedroom was finally taken down. Eleanor nodded but said nothing. "It needs a fresh coat of paint, though," he added, filling the space left by her silence. "There's a great yellow square where the mattress used to be. You can make out the flower design." There was a whole set of difficult circumstances associated with Barnaby's use of the bathroom, but perhaps it would be indelicate to go into them here. Suffice it to say that taking a shower was very difficult. A bath was out of the question, and using the toilet presented such a set of challenges that even a skilled contortionist would have found himself not quite up to the task. In the evenings, when they would occasionally light up the barbecue for their evening meal, the family would sit around the garden table, Eleanor, Alistair, Henry and Melanie taking the 4 seats under the large sunshade, while Barnaby hovered beneath its pointed peak, prevented from drifting off into the atmosphere by the strong green canvas that held him in place. He was banned from putting tomato ketchup on his hot dogs or burgers, as it had a terrible habit of falling down on one or all of their heads. "But I like tomato ketchup," Barnaby would complain, thinking this was most unfair. He could, of course, say more than "ow" by now. "And I prefer not to have to shampoo my hair every day," replied his father. At such times, Captain W.E. Johns would sit on the ground staring up at the boy, awaiting instructions. The dog had decided that this floating child was his sole master and would take direction from no other. But the days were often rather boring. Eleanor had given up work shortly after Melanie's birth, so she and Barnaby were left alone together for great stretches of time, with only Captain W.E. Johns to act as a buffer between them. They almost never left the house during daylight hours, as Eleanor did not want to be seen in public with her son in case people pointed and stared. Alistair, too, refused to take Barnaby with him when he strolled across to Kirribilli Market on Saturday morning, browsing through the stalls for a bargain, as he knew that he would inevitably become the exact type of person he had always despised, somebody different. Because of this, Barnaby grew into an unusually pale child, as he almost never saw direct sunlight. For a time, Eleanor would tie him to the washing line on the back lawn and let him hover in the fresh air for a couple of hours. When there was a breeze, he might even rotate for an afternoon, ensuring an even tan. Eventually, however, she was forced to put a stop to this, as there were several extravagant bird feeders placed in different areas of the garden, and a 4-year-old boy tied by his ankles to a washing line and waving his arms around in the air, like a lunatic, made him seem more like a scarecrow than anything else, and the birds stopped coming. "He's as white as a ghost," said Alistair, looking up at his son one evening as they were eating dinner. "Almost as white as our ceilings used to be," remarked Eleanor, before they had mattresses nailed to them. "It can't be good for him, though, can it?" "We've discussed this, Alistair," said Eleanor with a sigh, resting her fork on the side of her plate. "If we take him outside, what will the neighbours think? They might even suspect that we all float behind closed doors." "Oh, really, Eleanor," said Alistair, laughing at the idea. "I've never floated in my life, you know that. I keep my feet firmly on the ground." "And there's the other children to think of," she added. "What if the boys in Henry's class, for example, hear about Barnaby and think that Henry floats too? They might stop being friends with him." "I'm sure they wouldn't. It's not a choice that Barnaby's made, after all. It's just the way he was born. Tell that to Henry when he's being beaten up in the schoolyard." I don't think that would. Children can be very cruel, she continued, ignoring her husband's interruption. And anyway, it's easier to keep him under control here in the house. Think what might happen if we took him outside. He could simply float away and we'd never see him again. As she said this, she was bringing a forkful of lasagna to her mouth, but it hovered in mid-air before reaching her lips. For a moment, she realised how much easier life would be if this was to happen. Alistair glanced at her, and something passed between them. The germ of a terrible idea that remained unspoken for now. Anyway, if you're so concerned, you could always take him out when you come home from work, Eleanor said a moment later. Out of the question, replied Alistair instantly, shaking his head as if the idea needed to be rattled out of his brain and his ears before it did any damage. I will not, repeat not, make myself a figure of ridicule among our neighbours. Well then, don't expect me to. Perhaps we could hire someone, suggested Alistair, like a professional dog walker. But then we would have to explain his condition